All right, folks, I think this is episode 25 of Going South. I am really, really excited today to talk to Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. He is the author of many, many books, including, I guess it's already been released, The Third Construction, How Our Moral Movement is Overcoming the Politics of Division and Fear. I think you co-authored that with Reverend Barber. But he's also solely authored a number of other books, including Strangers at the Door, A True Story of Finding Jesus an Unexpected Guest, and the New Monasticism, what it has to say about today's church. He is also the founder and director of the School of Conversion in Durham. Is that right?
That's right, Durham, North Carolina.
Yeah, assistant pastor of St. John's Missionary Church. He's a graduate of Duke Divinity School, which I got rejected from. So I used to keep my rejection letter from Duke. So I'm a little jealous. But anyway, I've seen a couple of talks by him. We don't really know each other, but I've been amazed at his ability to take the gospel, something that has really impacted my life in Vacation Bible School. I don't know if you went to Vacation Bible School.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
And that story, that I remember the song of Jesus loving all the little children. And even then having an acute awareness of where are they at? Because I don't see the red, yellow, black, and white around me. And I also knew what my family would say about folks that looked real different from me. So your history is one that fascinates me. And I guess the place I'd like to start, and I know you're probably tired of sharing your story because you've done it so many times, but if you could tell folks a little bit about the place you come from, your work in DC with Strom Thurmond, I think that'd be a good jumping off point, if that's okay.
Well, it's good to be with you, Mark. I grew up in Stokes County, North Carolina, which is just down the road from Mayberry, if you've ever seen the Andy Griffith Show. As a matter of fact, Mayberry was based on a place in Surrey County, a real place called Mount Airy, and that's where all my mama's people are from. So my great granny grew up with Andy Griffith in that town, and our family's only real claim to fame is that he didn't change the names when he wrote his show. So our Uncle Otis made it into the script as the town drunk. And I grew up in that place and grew up in the 80s and the 90s when, as I've come to understand, our place and our people were very much the intentional target of a campaign to recruit white Christians for right-wing conservative politics. And I very much was a sincere kid in that culture who wanted to do all that I could for Jesus. So I wanted to become the president of the United States as a teenager. And I knew Jimmy Carter had done it as a Baptist from the South. So I was going to try to learn from his path he had taken from down there in Georgia, where you are. And I knew he'd gone to the Naval Academy, so I was trying to get to the Naval Academy. And the first roadblock I ran into was I didn't know any U.S. senators to recommend me. So I decided I needed to spend some time in the Senate. And I went to work for Strom Thurmond as a page when I was 16 years old. So that was my introduction to DC culture and to very much the sort of daily practice of the politics that I had been taught was aligned with my faith. And it was, in going to those committee meetings and sort of observing what everyday life was about for folks involved in that I began to realize that there was a wide gap between what we were actually working for and what we had learned in those Vacation Bible School lessons that you were talking about. So that was the beginning of my own personal struggle to try to find a new way to live out my faith in public life.
Are you still Southern Baptist?
Well, I'm still a Baptist. I have been able to remain Christian and practice my Baptist faith by learning from Black sisters and brothers who, were told, 2 centuries back, were told by people who called themselves Christian that they should both, give their lives to Jesus and serve them as their slaves. And they took that message, took that story, and heard in it the liberating good news that Jesus sets the captives free. So we sing the same songs, we read the same King James version of the Bible, but it sounds very different, echoing down the generations of people who've known that liberative good news of a Jesus who sets them free.
Yeah. That, and the other thing I've heard you speak about, and I was hoping you would talk about it today, is the melding of white supremacy with kind of evangelicalism, particularly in the kind of Baptist vein. Could you just say something about how that, and you kind of alluded to it a minute ago, but
Well, it
how,
has a long history in this
yeah,
country.
yeah,
It
in
was,
kind of different forms, right?
yeah, there has been since the very beginning, not only in Virginia but also in Massachusetts, a slaveholder religion that was willing to take the practice of owning other human beings based on the race, the color of their skin. Race was created to make this system work. To use that as a justification for owning other people. And that was something that Christians accommodated themselves to, and then went back and read the Bible in such a way that it wouldn't make us uncomfortable with that accommodation. That took some time and some real wrestling thought. I mean, people were paid uh, to write books and preach sermons that would help, make sense of that for folks. It was a process. It took time. And so I think knowing that history is important to understanding, in particular, what's happened over the past 40 years in the United States, which is, I think, a way of reimagining that tradition to justify the particular form of white supremacist politics that we have now, which is very much, embodied in the extremism of Trump and the MAGA movement. But it's not like it came out of nowhere. I mean,
Right.
that was created by 40 years of organizing that connected faith with this kind of extreme and frankly anti-democratic notion that a increasingly small white population and white culture should have dominance, in the nation's life. And they realized after the civil rights movement, the folks who organized this realized that it couldn't be done in the name of race after the civil rights movement, and they needed to do it in the name of something else. And religion is what they chose. So the religious right and the emergence of traditional values as an appeal to white people and white culture is an important part of the story of how we got to where we are.
Yeah, it seems like the discourse, the language changes, right? Largely because of movements and then folks who want to maintain kind of white dominance and white supremacy have to figure out a new way to package it, right? So we can't really say we don't want folks of color voting today. We don't want immigrants. So what we're going to say is there's massive voter fraud, right? Or systematic voter fraud. You have to package it a new way, even if there's no evidence to that effect.
That's right. And that transition has happened before.
Yeah.
I mean, the Civil War was about slavery, and folks were quite explicit about that before the war.
Yeah.
But after the war, and after the Reconstruction amendments that allowed the Southern states back into the Union, it became very much about a lost cause religion and a way
States'
of
rights.
life, and frankly, lots of myths that are very similar to the ones we hear now about fraud and about the way our culture and our uh, nation was stolen from us. These are echoes of what we've heard before. So, and I'm not saying that these people have studied history closely. I'm just saying it's a pattern that repeats itself, and that in particular, I think Christians have to pay attention to the way that our faith has consistently been manipulated and abused to prop up this sort of extremism. And yet, at the same time, there are always people of the same faith who have resisted that and who have built movements that have challenged that. And so I think faith has a power not only to, be twisted and unite people around extremism, but also to unite people around a moral movement for the common good, which is what we desperately need in this moment.
Yeah. Do you think that's the story of the Christ? That you know what it means to bear a cross, what it means. I've had a couple of evangelical conservative folks on. I mean, the point of this podcast was a response to local conservative radio excluding voices and so on. But
different kind of talk radio.
Yeah, right. And these are brothers and sisters of mine who claim to be Christian, but won't have a public discussion about their impact on our community and claims they're making. Right. But, the conservative folks I've talked with, they have let me put it this way. And I don't know if you've ever, we have a church on every corner in Georgia, right? We're the buckle of the Bible Belt kind of thing. Yep. And I was talking with one person how, in all the hours I've spent in churches and all the church signs I've seen, I've never seen a sermon on what it means to love your enemy. I really haven't. And
Jesus thought that was pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the fascinating thing
we have.
Right. The core message of the Christ, right, of Jesus and what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to not prioritize wealth and, love your neighbor as yourself and not save your life. You'll lose your life in order to save your life. I'm just constantly amazed at how all of that is lost among those of us who call ourselves Christian. And what do you think it is that we focus on? I mean, my Christian brothers and sisters here will want to talk about homosexuality as it relates to Leviticus, right? But they'll line up at the all-you-can-eat shrimp, buffet and kind of skip what Leviticus has to say about shellfish and other things. You know what I mean? Like we gravitate to some way to throw stones instead of what I consider. When people ask me about my leftist politics, because I'm far left, I just think Jesus was a radical. I think he was a leftist. I think his message is revolutionary, and it's a difficult one.
Yes, indeed. Jesus' message is revolutionary. Yeah. Sometimes even challenges leftist politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think what you're pointing to is an important thing for Christians to take seriously. I mean, I'm a pastor and I teach in churches. I'm always trying to get people to pay attention to the Bible. And one of the things that I think we have to be clear about is that what we have seen happening in our public life in the name of Christianity has very little to do with what the Bible actually says. This is not the result of people spending a great deal of time and attention attending to the teachings of Jesus. This is rather the result of hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in using faith to manipulate people to believe that, there's somehow this gut level connection between their faith and the, crusade to take America back for, conservative values and for some kind of imagined past that never really existed. Yeah. I mean, there's been a good bit of attention since the riot at the Capitol to Christian nationalism and the role that it plays, because, it was obvious that people who were there storming the Capitol and, breaking the law and frankly, trying to overturn the election were carrying crosses and, signs that said Jesus 2020 and right. Reporter with the New Yorker who went into the Senate gallery with that crowd, recorded them standing in a circle and praying this sort of prayer of thanksgiving. But I mean, it has a very cultish feel to it when you watch it, because it sort of just takes to the logical conclusion this kind of narrative that's been offered, which is essentially a cult. This notion that that the values of the nation are rooted in this white Christian past that had this kind of theocratic imagination for what the nation was going to be, and that only by getting back to that imagined past can we be the sort of true America that folks are told that they ought to be. Well, that's not only is that not what we were in the past, but that's not what on my reading of Scripture God wants any nation to be. God's pretty clear in the Bible about what God expects from nations, and God is consistently speaking up on behalf of those who are marginalized, those who are poor, the immigrant and the alien stranger among you, the Bible says. You ought to welcome them. And he's not talking about, people just, inviting somebody into their home for dinner. Right. Jesus says, this is how nations will be judged. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me something to drink? When I was incarcerated, did you come see me at the prison? Well, those are things that, are about politics. And I think you're absolutely right. The politics of Jesus is pretty obviously challenging to most of the ways that human beings negotiate power.
Yeah. And God's not American. Jesus isn't American, right? I mean, I've just felt for years that
the Mormons are at least honest about this. The Mormons say God gave us a special revelation here in this place.
Right.
All the other white Christians try to say that this story that came out of Palestine is about the U.S. being the center of the earth. That's right. Pretty.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that folks can take a Middle Eastern religion, right, and whitewash it, for political and racial purposes is kind of an amazing phenomenon. But I felt for years that, and I've been disappointed in my Christian brothers and sisters who are liberal, that the story has been hijacked. And there hasn't been resistance in a loving way to who dominates that story, or who controls the story, as if it can be controlled. But I guess there has always been the social teachings of the Catholic Church. There was always a progressive evangelical movement that pushed back. There's always been a Black church in America that has had a very different take on this. But I think you are right that there has not been widespread investment in making that narrative central in the public square and in challenging the Christian nationalist narrative. And that's why I'm so grateful for today's Poor People's Campaign, which calls itself, we call ourselves a national call for moral revival. And from the very beginning, we have said that it's a moral issue, not only that we have the extreme poverty and inequality and racism and ecological devastation that, is normalized in our society, but it's also just as important that it's done, in the name of this distorted moral narrative. And so we have to be a movement, not exclusively Christian, not exclusively religious, but we have to be a movement of all people that challenges that kind of distortion of religion. Yeah, I just remember Dr. King's kind of critique of moderate white Christianity, right, and its silence and Malcolm X's and so on. I want to come back later to the movement stuff that you and Reverend Barber are part of, but I'm just also wondering back to you personally when. So I came back from the Philippines and I had this crisis of faith. I'd been a missionary somewhere that was 82% Catholic. We were not spreading the love of God. We were trying to make people see things our way. Yeah. And I gotta say, was in terms of was it just a rational thing that you realized that your religious faith, your religious tradition was kind of white supremacist, or did you really have to grapple with redefining and kind of salvaging what you could from your faith tradition to continue on? Because a lot of people probably would have abandoned it, or I went down the road of Zen and other traditions, but I mean, was it painful? Was it tough?
Oh, yeah, very painful. And part of the pain is that I knew as I began to grapple with this, that what I was trying to deconstruct and sort out in terms of the lies that I had been told to me by sincere people, who loved me and who were trying to do what was right. And I was not ever in a place where I wanted to completely reject those people. Right. I still don't. I think people have been manipulated. I think human beings have a capacity to believe, two things at the same time, even when they contradict each other,
Absolutely.
and that often that we are, I mean, it's actually my faith that helps me make sense of this. The Apostle Paul is quite clear in his writings that that human beings are often at war with ourselves on the inside. He says we do what we don't want to do, and we don't do what we want to do. That's
Yeah.
a pretty, I think that's a pretty faithful rendering of much of human history,
Yeah.
and much of my own journey and struggle. And I know it's true of those people who taught me the faith. And so while I certainly knew, as I began to see the danger of the way my faith was twisted, that I had to reject that and walk away from it, I also received the gift of mentors and people of faith who practiced their Christianity and, frankly, their Judaism and their Islam and other traditions in a way that really brought people together and led us to work together for justice. So I'm still a Baptist. I'm still a Christian because those are the things that have shaped me and that resonate in terms of my own sense of who I am. But I want to reach into the best of that tradition and connect with other people, uh, who are in their own ways trying to pursue the good and work together to challenge all of the ways that we're being diminished. Because at the end of the day, I mean, let's just be clear: these lies diminish the people who believe them, in addition to the people they hurt, through policies and sometimes through, violence and real acts of hatred, like we've seen recently.
Yeah. I think this is also, and I don't know if anybody's asked you this, but I also think it's tied to being Southern. And I'm just wondering, you're somebody that kind of holds on to your roots, right? But I've met, and I've been guilty of this, living in a very repressive place, that if you don't conform to the dominant narrative of evangelical fundamentalism, it's hard to, especially in small town USA, right, in the deep South, it's hard to kind of stay intact
Yeah,
spiritually, existentially, psychically. And so
hard to
I've
have a
said,
community.
yeah, it is, where you're looking for your people, and that's a difficult thing. So what we've seen is kind of this political flight from places like where I live now. And I've also just seen Southerners um, abandon their identity as Southerners when they relocate somewhere else. I've lived in some of the most progressive places in the country, and there's this kind of Southern guilt that folks take. There's the whole white guilt thing too at times, but um, it seems to me that isn't healthy for me to reject the place and the people I come from. It's not healthy for me. And I'm sure you've seen this as well. And it's okay, I think, for people to take on other faith traditions and other meditative and spiritual practices, hopefully in a way that's not kind of co-opting or
Yeah.
usurping them, as if we created them. But I often wonder, and I've asked folks this, who, I've had a lot of white brothers and sisters who find some Native American ancestry way, way back, and all of a sudden take on Native identity, right? And the question I've always had was, what does white spirituality look like?
Yeah.
So there seems to me like, and I don't know exactly what I'm trying to ask you, but I'm just wondering if you've seen this as well, that Southerners who kind of do have a political awakening around race or gender or a variety of other things, oftentimes leave home, go somewhere else that's progressive, leave all that behind, have this kind of shame and guilt about that, And I've had to tell my West Coast friends, look, we'll talk about slavery all day long. We'll talk about Jim Crow, debt peonage. We'll go down the list, but let's talk about how California came to be. Let's talk about the internment of the Japanese. It's an American phenomenon, but I think the South carries a special burden in the eyes of in the eyes of white folks across the country. So have you seen that too, like white Southerners abandoning?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm
Yes,
just
indeed. And like everybody who grows up in the South and goes off to school somewhere else, I was as a young person tempted to leave my accent and the stories that had made me behind in terms of trying to conform and live into some sort of socially acceptable way of being American. But I pretty quickly realized that story is also all messed up and full of white supremacy and lies too. Just a little bit more polite, a little bit neatened up. But I mean, I was going to college when the United States was, uh, uh, beginning the war on terror. So it was pretty easy to see that there was a whole lot of complicity to go around for all of us in terms of wreaking havoc in the world. Um, and so I think what's been most important to me, and in terms of my own spirituality, my own personal journey, has been going back in my own history, my own people's history, my own tradition, and listening to those voices which have grappled with these same questions that I face. I needed to listen to Will Campbell and to Clarence
yeah.
and to uh, you know Virginia and Clifford Durr down in Montgomery, Alabama, and what sense they were making of what it meant to be white in Alabama
Yeah.
as the civil rights movement was being born out of the local struggles there. And those are the stories that have shaped me in terms of what is my role, what how can I grow into a kind of more faithful and fully human way of being in the midst of this mess that we've inherited? Because frankly, I mean, none of us choose what we're born into,
Yeah.
but it's who we are, and it's who you're going to be till you die. No matter how hard you try to run from it. So, of course, we can all receive gifts from the people we meet, and we can all grow and become different people. But everybody begins from who they are. And so the key question to me has always been, how can I grow to be more faithful to the justice and the goodness and the truth that's at the heart of the tradition, and that resonates with other traditions. And I think that's the critical work for all of us to do, no matter who you are.
Do you still struggle with that? Like it seems to me, and it's probably an ego thing in Buddhist terms, right? But how one does work against dehumanization without being dehumanizing, you know,
Yeah.
particularly in the face of potential violence or in the face of overt hostility from folks.
Well, in the Christian tradition, there's a there's a sort of anthropology that confesses from the start that there's something twisted in all of us, right? Of course, the most famous text along these lines is from the letter to the Romans. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, it says, which is just a way of saying that um, there's something cracked at the core of all of us. And
It could be the thing that makes us human.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
And I find that resonates deeply with experience and with my reading of history and with other traditions, frankly. Um, uh, and so, what do we do with that? I mean, Jesus's uh, uh, good news that uh, people, and in particular the people who've been most rejected by the world, are in fact loved by God. The good news of forgiveness is where everyone can begin to own who they are with some hope of healing and moving forward. Um, but I think that's tied closely to Jesus's teaching that you mentioned earlier, that we are to love our enemy as we love ourselves. Um, Part of what that means is you can't learn to love yourself well until you've listened to your enemy, until you've listened to the person who, you have real tension with in this world around whatever the issues. Because as one of my sort of mentors in nonviolence taught me, loving your enemy is never just about sort of doing the right thing yourself. It's actually a process through which you can learn something that you couldn't learn otherwise. And for him, that became an important sort of practical way that the teaching of Jesus, which of course influenced Gandhi and influenced the whole nonviolent movement in the United States, um, teaches us something about how our interaction with others, even those who we find ourselves most opposed to in terms of the struggles of our lives, are confrontations in which we can learn something. And not just about politics or the way to negotiate things, but we can learn something about ourselves. It sort of reveals something about the work that we need to do on ourselves.
Well, I think it's the whole kind of Buddhist adage of when the student's ready, the teacher appears kind of thing. Well, I often wondered if, again, kind of not to meld Buddhism, but with Christianity, but I think the Buddha would say, you don't have enemies. It's not personal in a way, given the fact that, like you said, we're all a product of our conditioning and causes and socialization, that in many ways, even folks that are violent or destructive are actually operating from a flawed place, just like we do at times. Does that make any sense? Like if we really know love, there aren't any enemies, because we know people are a product of all their experiences, their backgrounds, and so forth. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, I hear that. I hear that for sure. And I know that in the rough and tumble of our human existence, uh, a lot of us experience enmity, right? So I think there is a deep, human and spiritual truth to what you're saying, and I think that while the Buddhist tradition might have a way of explaining that, I think my own tradition would say it has something to do with the fact that the image of God is stamped on every one of us, right? So there is a kind of commonality in the midst of struggle, and yet I think enmity is precisely the thing that keeps us from seeing that, right? So the practice of loving the one who is acting as your enemy is a practice that allows us to learn to see that of God in everyone. That's not at least in my own experience, that's not an easy thing to do. The Buddhist tradition may have some meditative.
Yeah, I can talk about it all day long. Doing it, another whole thing, right? But it is.
I've learned a good bit from those meditative practices that the Buddhist tradition offers, and that other traditions have too. And I think that the sort of practical experience of interacting in a way that intends to love with the person who is your enemy is itself a process. I think, for example, of the story that Jim Lawson used to tell early on in the campaign in Nashville, when they were trying to.
He was with CORE, right?
He had come down with SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to do nonviolence training in Nashville ahead of the sit-in movement, and they were beginning to explore, how they could challenge Jim Crow. And in the midst of that, they were picketing outside a place that practiced segregation, and this guy came up to Lawson and spit in his face. And Lawson had been in India trying to study Gandhi's, practice of nonviolence when he heard about King and the Montgomery bus boycott and came back, and he had connected with them. And that's why he was doing the work he was doing. So he had been, trying to do this personal work at this point for a decade of his life. And people who were there said that they saw him get, this spit in the face. And he turned to the person who had spit at him and said, could I ask you, do you happen to have a handkerchief on you?
Oh.
And the guy reached into his pocket and gave him a handkerchief. Now, this is the man who had just come to spit in his face. And he used this guy's handkerchief to wipe his own spit off his face, handed it back to him, and then engaged him in conversation about something that, was not part of what they were doing, something that was happening on the street. And I just think, that's something you gotta train your muscles to do that, right? Like that's a practice that I think can fundamentally change the way we are engaging with one another and what we see in one another. And that's what Lawson was trying to teach the young people in Nashville, what he was trying to learn himself. And of course, John Lewis, who just died last year, Lawson spoke at his funeral. And I mean, he said until the end of his life that vision of the beloved community and of the practice of nonviolence as a whole way of life was really what shaped his whole way of seeing the world.
So can we talk a little bit about your work with Reverend Barber? I mean, because from what I understand of it, and I've paid attention to it over the years, especially Moral Mondays when they first kind of kicked off, is in many ways, and it's so good to see it, right? It is an extension of Kingian, radical revolution of values, right? That is multifaceted. It's not just about race. From my understanding, it's about class inequality. It's about American imperialism and militarism. It's about gender equality. Like, how did you stumble across Reverend Barber? Because I also understand that he played a role in kind of your understanding of your faith and race and all that.
Oh, yes, right. When I was trying to figure out, how to be Christian in a different way, I met this pastor, from another town here in North Carolina, who was talking about Jesus in a very different way, but in the way that he had learned from his father, who was a pastor, and from a whole tradition that I didn't know much about at that point. And so he began mentoring me when I was still a teenager, when I had just come back from Washington, D.C., and began, introducing me to that way of understanding faith and politics that he had inherited. It's part of the reason why I'm so adamant, really, that we can't simply offer a critique or try to expose Christian nationalism and the lies and distortions around faith. As important as I think it is to tell the truth about those things, it's not a sort of expose that saved me, nor that convinced me that that I could be something else. It was seeing and experiencing a different way of being Christian. And I think in so many places, like you were describing earlier, there's just not much evidence of that for people. There's not many ways that people could plug into that. And so I really have a sense of responsibility that that I and the movement that I'm part of, we're really called to build up places and communities where people can experience a different way of being in the places where they are, in rural Georgia and rural North Carolina. Because I think a lot of people at the Baptist church and a lot of people at the Methodist church aren't entirely comfortable with what's going on.
Well, there's been tons of people that have walked away from both too.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of people who've grown up there, they don't discount everything that they heard growing up, but they don't want to be part of it anymore because it's become clear to them that on the whole, the institution is doing more harm than good. and that I think is an indication to me that we need uh, uh, different kinds of communities and institutions for people to be part of.
How long is so you stumbled across Reverend Barber? He is kind of a model, and he has kind of a mechanism to plug into, right, to live your faith in a new way. Um, how much time are we talking to present day, and what did you do when you did plug in? What did you get involved in? Because and I say this because I'm in a place where I don't know, and I could just be ignorant of it, but I don't know of a congregation that does have a political analysis, black or white,
Hmm.
um, that really has this more radical reading of the gospel as
Yeah.
a political treatise, almost, in terms of what it means to follow Jesus.
Well, in terms of my own personal story, we met almost 25 years ago. And like I said, I was a teenager, so I was still, coming into the world, learning what it means to be an adult,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
getting married, having kids. But we've spent the last 20 years trying to build institutions. I mean, he spent he spent that quarter of a century pastoring a church and leading a community that really does have a full embrace of this understanding of what it means to be Christian. And I think that's an incredibly important thing, that the Greenleaf Christian Church exists, that other churches like it exist and are increasingly networked with one another through the Repairers of the Breach organization that we started, and through other networks like the Red Letter Christians Network, and uh, uh, um, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference of um, African American congregations that preach the liberative gospel. I mean, these networks are incredibly important, and that we learn how to connect with one another around living out that faith in public. That's what we've been doing through the Poor People's Campaign, really just for about 3 years now, and uh, that is very much about trying to create community in places all over the country. I mean, this sort of institution building takes time, but we now have coordinating committees for the Poor People's Campaign in 43 different states, and are trying to build out, local leadership and capacity for congregations to connect with, the unions, undocumented folks who are advocating for their rights, the women's rights organizations, the environmental activists in your community, so that there is a network that people can be part of, and to know that they're united in their struggles.
Well, how does that? Can we just talk about the mechanics of that? Because that sounds great theoretically. So, are there organizers on the ground in each place that is building those kind of relationships between networks and interested parties? Is that how
Yeah,
it
we,
works?
we believe in fusion politics. Moral fusion politics is about helping people see that there's a moral center around which we can unite, and that can bring people who are directly impacted by a wide variety of issues together in a coalition. And so that has to happen by connecting people, who have their own personal reasons and local reasons for being engaged in particular struggles. And so we create coordinating committees. So there's a coordinating committee in Georgia where you are. There's a coordinating committee in North Carolina where I am, and those coordinating committees are led by uh, someone who's a moral leader, so a pastor and a mom, a rabbi in their state, someone who's um, a directly impacted person, so an undocumented person, a poor person, a formerly incarcerated
Right.
person, that this issue is directly impacted them, and by someone who is an organizer, somebody who wants to help connect people in their state. So there's at least those three people at the core of this. And then these committees build networks. And often, to do that across the state, that means local networks that connect with networks. So there's, here in North Carolina, the different regions of our state has coordinating committees that interact with so it's very much about building a kind of leaderful movement of people who are connecting in order to coordinate our collective action and to help one another learn about how we're impacted in different ways by the policies that are being enacted at our state and federal level.
Well, how does, again, I'm sorry to pick your brain about this, but as someone who's been parts of coalitions where we've tried to, in another word, I think a fusion kind of in the academy is intersectional issues, right? That oppression takes different forms. But one of the struggles we've had is when we get a diverse group in the room, the dynamics in the room mirror that on the outside, right? So you'll have sexism in the room, you'll have racism in the room, often you'll have homophobia in the room. And I haven't seen, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but a process by which you're kind of doing that internal work as well as the external work, so the coalition will be sustainable. And not only that, we're all coming to the table realizing, as you said earlier, we're all cracked, right? And we may be privileged in some ways and oppressive in others. Do y'all, I guess, is what, like if for example, Valdosta, Georgia, where I'm at, so how does our work or how do we network? How do we build with y'all, and what do y'all do about those kinds of things that come up as we manifest our stuff in the effort and attempt to work together?
Well, I mean, I think there has to be some acknowledgement that that's just part of being human, that sort of interpersonal work has to happen, in an interpersonal way in every institution and gathering. So we're not going to ignore that, but we're also not going to imagine that the primary purpose of uh, organizing towards changing policy is that work, right? That it's important to have an agenda that people can unite around. So fusion politics is about offering an agenda that connects the various issues that impact a wide range of people. I think what you mentioned, as intersectionality is a sort of a separate question that is about how the kinds of injustice that exist systemically sort of stack up on people's identities in complex ways. And there's healing work and there's real justice work that's related to sorting through that. I think we take that as a given, but then acknowledge that building a fusion coalition means having a broad agenda that can present what addressing these systemic injustices could look like at the policy level, and giving people an opportunity to do that collective work together. Now, of course, there are going to be people who don't come along, but I think the other thing that we've acknowledged, and that I think is a part of the wisdom of this kind of organizing, is that you don't need a unanimity to make progress. You simply need a sort of critical mass, right, of people who are willing to move forward together. And so that's what we've been working to build through the moral movement and the Poor People's Campaign.
What are the biggest challenges y'all have found? I mean, because the other thing that seems to be happening in Georgia now is just really organized backlash. Particularly, we know the legislature, which is controlled by Republican conservative folks, right, are scrambling now, given the last runoff election, to figure out ways. I mean, our mayor literally said out loud that he kind of supports suppressing the vote, right? Because people are also feeding off that narrative that there's been I think some people believe it and probably most don't, but it's a useful narrative again, that there's been this widespread fraud that we now have to control for, which isn't the case. So I'm just wondering what y'all are encountering there, because the folks are active now in an attempt to undo kind of what's happened in the last election cycle.
Oh, absolutely. Voter suppression is the attempt, in our current context, it's the attempt to use the lie of voter fraud to justify a wide array of voter restrictions
Right.
that will make it more difficult for the broad coalition of people who again, do want to move forward together and to change many of these policies. And so we have tried to be clear in terms of policy work that expanding voting rights and a legal strategy to push back against these sorts of initiatives at voter suppression is a critical part of the kind of goals that a movement like ours has. I mean, we are determined right now. We're having Moral Mondays every week to make sure that we raise the minimum wage, to make sure that we expand access to health care to everyone, to make sure that we really address the climate crisis at the federal level. These are things that we think we have to use the power of the government to do. And at the same time, to be able to do that and to maintain the power that's necessary to do that through government, we have to put safeguards against voter suppression. And I think what that means necessarily in our context is that we need federal protections. We have to restore the Voting Rights Act, and we
Exactly.
have a Department of Justice that's willing and ready to enforce it, because states like Georgia and North Carolina, where I live, and others, that often former Confederate states, are certainly going to be doing this. And there's a very organized movement to do it through state legislatures, through an organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Yeah. Do you think that, well, a couple of things, and I really, again, appreciate your time, but having studied a little bit about Civil War, this not only does it feel like another period of Reconstruction, right, which is a pushback against the progressive movements that have, gotten us where we are today, but it seems to me that kind of the Trumpian alt-right MAGA movement is a second Confederacy in a way. I mean, the language is real similar. There are secessionist groups. I've worked with neo-Confederate groups, right, that see that as a solution. But I mean, I guess my question, having said that, I saw a talk with Reverend Barber recently where I think it was Cornel West and somebody else, where, and King brought this up, that given the priorities of our federal government, given Citizens United, given the corporate lobbying money, given that we spend more on weapons than we do social programs, which isn't a new, right? In 1967, when, I guess it was 67, when King gave the speech about Vietnam, right? Yeah. The triplets, right? The evil triplets of racism, kind of consumerism, militarism. The title of the conversation that Reverend Barber had is America May Go to Hell, and King talked about spiritual death. And I guess I just bring those up because it seems to me sometimes as an empire, we are in a period of decline, and it's up to a movement to redirect that. Does that make sense? And we've got many of the characteristics of former empires, be they Roman, Persian, Ottoman, British.
The great downside of empires in decline is that desperate people do things, and a lot of people can get hurt. Right. I'm not in any way interested in saving or redeeming the empire, but I am deeply interested in making sure that vulnerable people can survive. Yeah. And I think that means, at the very least, insisting that our government do what it's promised to do, right? To establish justice, you can't ensure domestic tranquility, which comes at the end of the list, unless you've begun by establishing justice, and and that means in the context of these issues that you just mentioned, that we have to make sure people have what they need to live. I mean, that's been the theme song of our campaign, the Poor People's Campaign. Everybody's got a right to live.
But is that the case in a capitalist society? Is that a case in a white supremacist society ideologically? Do you know what I mean? Because there's this part of me, having done this work for 3 decades now, and we'll continue to do it. I think that is the spiritual responsibility and journey, right? But it seems to me, some of the bigger lies that are ideological is that, in a capitalist society like our own, we're all just commodities. We're all expendable. We've all, you know what I mean? We're a resource to be exploited, as is the earth, as is anybody who's not white, right?
Well, while I've learned a great deal from various intellectual critiques of the systems that we live in, I don't, at the end of the day, consider any of this to be ideological. For me, I mean, I don't care so much about what the sort of theoretical imagination of the best economy is. I care about whether people can live, and whether people in this system can live, right? I mean, we've got to take seriously where we are and ask, what is it that's keeping people from people who work 2-3 jobs, people who are struggling with disease and don't have access to health care. We can talk about different ideas for how we get to making sure people have these things, and I think in any society that's going to be debated. But I think there has to be people who say there's just a sort of moral baseline that says that we ought to be able to agree that people have a right to live.
Yeah.
And
I think people will say that. And what I encounter here as an organizer, over the years, though, and this happened last week, conservative leaders here are poo-pooing on the, livable wage idea, $15 minimum wage, right? And what we're encountering is a lot of poor working class white folks that agree with them and will say things like, yeah, the solution is just get another job if you're not making enough money. The solution is, get a job with insurance if you don't have a job with, you know what I mean? That's why I bring up ideology, because it does seem to me that we've all been kind of seduced, and that continues on lifelong in this culture, to me, to buy into our own oppression at times. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess, do y'all encounter that specifically with working class white folks that will actually identify with an oligarchy or an elite or a power elite, like in our local community, folks that do not often care about them, but will actually, this is kind of the Civil War all over again to me, that, planter class who could, get substitutes to fight for them, or the planter class who had enough slaves could get out of fighting, would get poor white folks to go fight a war to expand and preserve slavery. So I guess that's the question, how do y'all address this thing that we're all been steeped in, that oftentimes works against our own interests because we have been lied to and we believe those lies?
I think the only way to resist that, which is obviously a dominant narrative and has recurred over and over again, is to have Black and white and brown people organizing together and saying that these are issues that impact all of us when it comes to a living wage. The CBO report that came out this week on the proposal that's before Congress to raise the minimum wage says that it would lift a quarter of African American and I think close to a third of Latinos out of poverty, right? Which is true, which is a way of saying that there's systemic racism in this kind of substandard wage that we have. And it's also true that the majority of people in raw numbers that it would impact is poor
Black
white
folk.
people,
Yeah.
right? Working class white people who uh, who have been given, this lie, what Du Bois called the wages of whiteness. This notion that you have some dignity in just the color of your skin, but also know very well that that they have to try to find a place to stay and uh, you know get their kids clothes and everything else on the same market as other folks. And so there is a solidarity that people can be organized around, and that I think once people begin to see how these things impact all of us, there's the potential that some of the lies we've been told about what differentiates us can be dispelled by the practice of pursuing better policies together.
So the transformation comes through kind of a common agenda where people recognize each other's humanity. And I would, it seems to me that in my own life, many of the kind of racist stereotypes I had of Black folks, for example, were dispelled when I actually had to go to school with folks and became friends with people. Yeah. So that's kind of what you're saying then, is this more kind of pragmatic, develop an agenda that appeals across class and race, get folks to work on that to the degree you can. And in that process, people discover that we all are humans, we all are children of the Creator.
I think that's right, because I think that's how we came to believe the lies, because the lies explained and justified the unjust system. And so it's only by changing the unjust system that we can begin to change the beliefs that we've, inherited to justify that system.
Can I ask one question? I won't keep you real long, but is your faith tradition metaphysical? Like, you know what I mean? Because when I had my crisis of faith, I remember going to the Wesley Foundation on campus, and the minister there, just the most beautiful, loving man, one of the many I've been graced with in my life, that showed me, that there's all kinds of ways to be in the world. But, he confessed to me that he really didn't care about the metaphysics of Christianity and the divinity of Christ, that wasn't significant. And that really, I can't tell you how that set me free, and also really made my faith tradition so much deeper. That for me, the focus is the humanity of the Christ, not necessarily if I'm going to an eternal place called heaven with a bunch of folks that I don't know if I want to spend eternity with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, have you had metaphysical experiences? Are you a, and I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't want to talk about it, but I'm just curious, as a fellow Christian and Southerner, and
well, I'll tell you, I have had metaphysical experiences. I think it'd be fair to describe them that way. Yeah. And I have also had the experience, what we call the dark night of the soul, where I have no way to access that sort of experience and feeling. And within the Christian tradition, there have been a lot of people, who've struggled with that reality, and with, how do you make sense of your faith when you don't feel it, when you can't connect? We learned after Mother Teresa's death that this was a good bit of the latter part of her life, that she just simply couldn't experience the connection of prayer that she had earlier in her life. So I guess what I'm saying is that in terms of experience, I don't think that the metaphysics are essential.
yeah.
And yet, having experienced it myself, I don't deny it. So in terms of what we know about life beyond this earth, I think we ought to be clear, Christians ought to be clear, that there are things that we believe by faith, not because we, have some sort of verifiable certainty about them. And there's no sense pretending that we know things we don't know. I even try to be clear and honest about this at funerals, because I think people are often tempted to sort of say more than we know in a way that's comforting to people. And I think the tradition does offer a lot that is comforting and that offers hope to people. But you know, that it's just not the case that the Bible or the Christian tradition says that you know, we know Uncle Charlie is sitting up there looking down on us right now. It's just not true. It didn't say that anywhere in the Bible. So I try not to slip into that sort of you know, soft spiritualization of our tradition that pretends to know things we don't know.
Yeah. Would you say the same thing about movements? Because it seems to me we should be involved in the movement regardless of the outcome. You,
Yeah, absolutely.
like,
Because the reason any movement works for justice is not because we know that full justice, or even that a certain percentage of justice can be achieved by this or that date. But as many people who've been part of the movement have taught me, that you know, freedom is a constant struggle, and that there is something about learning to struggle and to insist that something better than what we've experienced is possible. There's something about that struggle that is part of freedom, right?
absolutely.
A free people are not free unless they're free to imagine something better than what they
Right.
currently experience.
Yeah. That there's liberation in the very act.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there anything I've had you for a long time and I've really enjoyed it. Was
Well,
there
it's
any?
good to be with you this morning.
Yeah.
I
Can
woke
you?
up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom, and I got to talk to you a little bit about it. So
Oh, good.
let's keep working and
Yeah.
praying for the good.
Yeah. Can you just tell folks what's the best way to support the work you and Reverend Barber are doing? And I'll put links
Yeah,
to it as
please do
well.
go to poorpeoplescampaign.org.
Okay.
And I'd encourage you to join the campaign, learn more about the campaign, and support it as you're able.
Sounds great. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I love you. And I feel better knowing you're out there doing the work you're doing, as well as Reverend Barber. And that does something for me in terms of energizing me, especially in some of the places I've lived. So it's an honor and a pleasure to get to spend time. And thank you for making time today
Oh,
to
it's
chat
good
with me.
to be with you, Mark. Bless you.
Bless you.